This is the ongoing series in which I attempt to work my way through the entire original Game Boy library, 3 games at a time. In each episode, I'll talk about one game that I like and one game that I don't. And finally, a third mystery game that could be good or it could be bad. All I can say for sure is that it will certainly be Game Boy. This is the good, the bad, and the Game Boy. Now, unlike the Halloween season, which has no shortage of season-appropriate games to play through and talk about, the holiday season doesn't really have a whole lot of video games associated with it, and even fewer that anyone would consider good. With few exceptions, the only true Christmas-themed video games are the games that are based on Christmas movies, like Batman Returns and Home Alone. By this definition, the Game Boy only has 2 Christmas games in its entire library: Home Alone 1 and Home Alone 2. Now, even without playing either of these games, I think we both know that I'm unlikely to like either one of them. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to be thinking outside the box a little bit and focusing on some games that are objectively better, even if I have to kind of stretch the definition of what actually makes a Christmas game. These are games that originally released during the holiday shopping season of their respective years. Now, it goes without saying that just like always, I am focusing on the North American release date for all these games. If you received any of these games when they first came out, odds are pretty good you received them as Christmas presents. At least, that's the theory I'm going with here. I'm just trying to avoid talking about Home Alone. Ninja Turtles mania burned with a hot fervor in my soul during the Christmas season of 1989. And almost all the way through the following year, I continued to enjoy the seemingly endless bounty of merchandise and media the franchise produced. In addition to the toys, comics, and cartoons, we received a surprisingly decent live-action movie. And at the end of the year, I received Fall of the Foot Clan as a birthday gift. But as Christmas of 1990 rolled around and my interest in the toys waned, I began to suspect that my brightest days with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were behind me. I continued to experience diminishing returns with the Ninja Turtles all the way throughout 1991. The second live-action movie wasn't quite as good as I hoped it would be, and the sizable collection of action figures and vehicles that I had accumulated in previous years had, with a small amount of regret, been retired to the back of my closet. Despite feeling like I was outgrowing the Ninja Turtles, I continued to enjoy video games based on the series, and Fall of the Foot Clan and, of course, the arcade game had remained 2 of my personal favorites. And it was right around this time, Christmas of 1991, that I received the follow-up to one of my very favorite Game Boy games, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2: Back from the Sewers. Back from the Sewers is a much more sophisticated game than Fall of the Foot Clan. The graphics are arguably better, at least in regards to the character sprites, which have much more detail and shading than what we saw in Fall of the Foot Clan. I wouldn't necessarily say that the environments look better than those from Fall of the Foot Clan, but they do have a much more cartoonish look to them, which is probably a bit more in keeping with the cartoon and the arcade game, rather than the darker, slightly more realistic look from the first game. The music is also quite good. I definitely wouldn't say that this soundtrack is better than Fall of the Foot Clan's, but by this point the Ninja Turtles arcade game had established the distinctive jazzy and upbeat style that Konami would use for the series going forward. And admittedly, Back from the Sewers soundtrack sounds much more like a proper Ninja Turtles game, even if it doesn't quite reach the greatness of Michiru Yamane's score from the previous game. The levels are larger and contain much more elaborate scenarios and mechanics, from the straightforward side-scrolling action stages to the belt-scrolling skateboarding and surfing stages. The turtles can also cling to certain overhead surfaces and flip up and down between floors to discover hidden pizzas, which for some reason are given to you by foot soldiers. I wonder what Shredder would say if he knew these guys were helping you. In between stages, you could play either a pizza collecting minigame to recover some health, or a quick boss battle where you can rescue a fallen turtle by defeating a security robot within a strict time limit. Now, on its surface, Back from the Sewers appears to be an improvement over the original game in pretty much every regard. But even as a kid, I recognized that it wasn't much of an improvement. In fact, in some ways, it was actually a much worse game. For starters, I immediately took a dislike to the graphics. Not the quality of the graphics, but the character designs themselves. The sprites were much more detailed and expressive, sure, but they also looked really stupid. The foot soldiers looked like slightly overweight men wearing baggy pajamas. Boss characters like Bebop, Rocksteady, and Baxter Stockman have all been drawn in a strange, big-headed art style, and the characters all move with crude, simple animations. But what's worse is how the game plays. The controls are fine, but the hit detection feels unfairly sensitive, which is made even worse by the fact that the game often puts you in situations where it feels like taking damage is unavoidable. You're frequently being asked to make leaps of faith that all too often drop you directly into some kind of completely untelegraphed danger, like landmines you can barely see or jets of fire that only activate when you jump over them. In a couple stages, you have to slog through an endless wave of mousers rushing at you from both sides. And then there's the combinations of multiple obstacles at once that I'm convinced are impossible to get through unscathed. Now, despite all these flaws, I don't believe that Back from the Sewers is a bad game. In fact, I don't believe there exists a bad Konami game from that era. However, I don't think it's a particularly good game either. Now, I couldn't tell you whether I received this game as a present in 1991 or if it was afterwards when I started spending some of my Christmas money. But what I am certain of is that even at the time, I recognized Back from the Sewers as just one more example of how the Ninja Turtles series was failing to captivate me the way it once did. Mega Man 3 quietly released in the shadow of a certain other Game Boy game that hogged the spotlight in the holiday season of 1992. Previews for the game seemed to be minimal, and I'm not even entirely sure I knew it had been released at all until gaming magazines published their reviews in January of 1993. Nintendo Power themselves buried the game in the back of their Game Boy section, behind games like Incredible Crash Dummies and Battleship. Mega Man 3 was the fifth Mega Man game that Capcom had published between the holiday seasons of 1991 and 92. It's safe to say that Mega Man fatigue was setting in, and the previous two Game Boy entries clearly hadn't convinced gaming publications that the series was worth making a big fuss about. Now, in spite of my disappointment with how Mega Man 2 had turned out, and you can say what you want, but that game was a blight on the entire series, I was all too eager to give Mega Man's Game Boy series another chance. Following the formula established by the first two games, Mega Man 3 sets players against the remaining four bosses from the NES version of Mega Man 3: Snake Man, Shadow Man, Spark Man, and Gemini Man. After a short Dr. Wily stage, you then faced four robots from Mega Man 4: Dust Man, Dive Man, Drill Man, and Skull Man. You then squared off against a ninth robot named Punk, who was the only original boss character in the game. With Punk defeated and his sub-weapon added to Mega Man's arsenal, you would then enter the game's final stage and face Dr. Wily himself. After sidelining Mega Man 2, developer Minakuchi Engineering has returned with a vengeance. And I mean that literally, these guys seem pissed. And I'm convinced that they are using Mega Man 3 to punish us for whatever wrongdoing they believe we have committed. Every criticism I made about Dr. Wily's Revenge applies to Mega Man 3, possibly even to a stronger degree. The screen is still too small, and the NES sprites are still a bit too crowded on the tiny Game Boy screen. There are more ridiculously precise jumps to make, more traps that require almost pixel-perfect gameplay, and what certainly seems to be the highest density of instant death traps that we've seen in a Mega Man game since, well, probably ever. Dust Man stage is probably the best example of the unflinching cruelty of Mega Man 3's design. The level opens up with several jumps over bottomless pits with those annoying enemies that shoot up to knock you out of the air. Shortly after that, as you are descending through a number of vertically oriented screens, you reach this screen where you have to drop through an opening in the center of the room. What's impossible to know unless you've played through the level before is that waiting for you in the next screen is a giant robot that leaps at you as soon as you drop into the room. You have to know in advance to pull hard to the right to avoid taking damage. Then there's the tight jumps across pits and spikes where it's all too easy to hit your head on the low-hanging ceilings and fall to your death. And of course there's this room, where the safest way over the spikes is to take intentional damage and run across using your invincibility period. And the game knows this is a dick move, that's why it gives you a large health refill immediately afterwards. And assuming you made it through this gauntlet, The level wraps up by forcing you to slide directly into the path of one of those patrolling shield enemies. Granted, not all of Mega Man 3's stages are as extreme as Dustman's stage, but the vindictive nature of this game's stage design is present to some degree in almost every other level in the game. And then there's the fight with Punk, who is what Metal Man would probably look like if he got mutated by that ooze from Ninja Turtles 2. Punk has a very simple attack pattern. He jumps around at the far side of the room throwing saw blades at you, which aren't terribly hard to avoid, but then he turns into a giant saw blade himself and zips across the room. You have to either jump or slide to avoid him, depending on whether he crosses the room high or low, and he doesn't telegraph what height he's going to use. Due to the small size of the room and the speed he moves at, successfully avoiding him pretty much comes down to luck rather than reflexes, and he will completely take you out in just 3 hits. So it's a good idea to come into this battle with a full stock of E-Tanks. Now you might think that all this would make me absolutely hate this game. But to be honest, I've always loved Mega Man 3, and it's not because I appreciated the extra challenge, because I assure you, I did not. What I did appreciate was what a massive improvement it was over the first 2 games. In fact, in some ways, the Game Boy version of Mega Man 3 even improves on the original NES game. Snake Man's stage opens up with these animated palm trees in the background. I love that. And Gemini Man's stage has animated foreground elements. Granted, these are sometimes a bit distracting and probably don't do much to help with the game's slowdown, but damned if they don't look pretty cool. And gone are the hokey, super deformed character sprites from Mega Man 2. The enemies in this game appear more or less exactly as they did in the original NES games. A few of the larger enemy sprites have been shrunken down a bit, but in a very clean way compared to the clumsily abbreviated look from Mega Man 2. In short, Mega Man 3 is, from top to bottom, an incredibly sharp-looking game. Now, the NES versions of Mega Man 3 and 4 has some of the best music in the series, and this music has made a very clean transition to the Game Boy. The music in this game is awesome, with excellent renditions of those classic NES themes, and a handful of original tracks too, including an absolute banger of a Dr. Wily theme. As a kid, I had a particular attachment to the NES versions of Mega Man 3 and 4, and my fondness for Mega Man 3 might have something to do with how well it represented those games. Also, my relief that Capcom seemed to have turned the corner on whatever the hell happened with Mega Man 2 might have also supercharged my opinion of Mega Man 3. And even as a kid, I recognized that there was actual value in not being able to finish a game on the first day you received it, which is likely one of the few positives that I was able to take from my experience with Mega Man 2. But regardless of my reasoning, Mega Man 3 was my favorite game in the Game Boy Mega Man series as a kid. And even though I still find it overly punishing and more than a little unfair, I still have something of a soft spot for it as an adult. I think it's common knowledge at this point that the best Ghostbusters game of the 8-bit era was the one we never got in North America, HAL Laboratory's Famicom version of Ghostbusters 2, or New Ghostbusters 2 as I guess it was called. However, we did get it on the Game Boy. Kind of. Despite owning not one but 2 copies of this game for years, it's only been just recently that I finally got around to actually playing it, in preparation for this video. Because not only did this game come out in December with absolutely no fanfare whatsoever, the movie itself takes place during the holiday season, making this the most Christmas-appropriate game that I've talked about today. By the way, which label do you like better? I think I prefer this one. I've never played the Famicom version of Ghostbusters 2, but I am familiar enough with it to know that the Game Boy game is extremely similar but not a direct port. I'm sure if you direct your attention to the comment section, you'll find a few explanations of how the 2 versions of the game differ, as well as probably a number of assertions that one version of the game is significantly better than the other, because, you know, that's what the comment section is for. However, for the sake of this video, I'll be talking about Ghostbusters 2 as a standalone experience, as I think it's good enough to be judged on its own merit. And this game is really good. You start the game by choosing any 2 of the 4 Ghostbusters. You only have direct control over the first character you pick. The second character just kind of follows along behind you as your partner. The object of every stage is to find and dispose of all the ghosts in the level, which your 2 characters do as a team. Pressing A will activate your lead character's proton beam, which stuns the ghost in place as your computer-controlled partner gets into position. Once your partner is properly lined up, pressing B will make him throw out his trap and finish the ghost off for good. It's a simple premise, but the gameplay is fast-moving and immediately engaging. The ghosts in each level appear in waves. Many ghosts won't appear until you capture ghosts in another part of the level, so you have to do a bit of exploring to track down all the enemies on each floor. Every stage has a time limit to catch all the ghosts. Now this timer isn't so tight that you'll need to worry too much about playing absolutely perfectly, but you can't dilly-dally too much either. If the time runs out before you trap all the ghosts, the remaining enemies will turn into fast-moving Ghostbusters logos and bounce all over the stage, making them more dangerous and harder to catch. Occasionally you'll find one of the other Ghostbusters casually leaning against the wall. If you interact with them, they'll trade places with one of your characters and also give you a temporary power-up, like invincibility, or being able to walk freely through walls, or trading your stock proton pack for the slime blower, which instantly destroys any ghost you hit with it. You'll also encounter Dana Barrett and Louis Tully, who will either give you an additional unit on your life bar or more time to the clock. There are only 3 levels in the game, each representing key scenes from the movie, like the courthouse, the subway/sewers, and finally the art museum. Each level ends with a boss fight against one of the villains from the movie, like the Scarrilli brothers, the Train of Dead Souls, and of course, Janos and Vigo the Carpathian. The game isn't extraordinarily difficult, but it can be tricky, safely guiding you and your partner through each stage. Each of the 2 Ghostbusters have their own life bar. If either one of them gets touched by a ghost, they'll lose one of their lives. If anyone's life bar gets down to 0, even if it's your partner, the game ends and you'll have to continue at the start of the stage. The stages also become increasingly difficult to move around in, with narrow hallways and rooms cluttered with objects that hinder your mobility. And in later stages, ghosts will frequently surprise you by materializing out of nowhere or outmaneuvering you in tight areas. For the most part, the game controls very well. The pathfinding capabilities of the partner characters definitely get the job done, but they will still often get hung up on the geometry of the stage, leaving them vulnerable to attack. And on rare occasions, they will even get pulled into an enemy as the game tries to position them to lay a trap or fall into place behind the lead character. It doesn't happen often enough to be a nuisance, but taking damage from enemies doesn't always feel like it's necessarily your fault. Ghostbusters 2 definitely is not the most visually impressive game on the Game Boy, especially compared to other HAL games like Kirby's Dream Land, but the graphics are clean and well drawn. The Ghostbusters sprites remind me quite a bit of pop figures, with that quaint and heavily stylized design that still somehow manages to resemble the characters from the movie in spite of their minimalist art style. And the music is good. It fits the vibe of the game well enough, but it's not especially memorable or attention-grabbing. However, Ghostbusters 2 as a game is greater than the sum of its parts. With fun and addictive gameplay, a cute and appealing art style, and just the perfect amount of challenge, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed this game. In fact, it's probably my favorite Game Boy game that I've played all year. And so that's 3 more games added to this year's Naughty or Nice list, and still literally hundreds to go. I guess I really have my work cut out for me in 2024. But in any event, regardless of which holiday you celebrate, whether it's Christmas or Hanukkah or I'm not sure what else there is, I sincerely hope that you are happy doing it. And once again, thank you for watching the good, the bad, and the Game Boy.